as well. Let's see. Mm. Awesome, awesome. Hello and happy Friday, comrades, friends, community. You are tuned into Revolution Within the Revolution, a show of the National Network on Cuba. And let's be clear, this is not a neutral space. This is not a space for nuance, for imperialism. This is a space rooted in struggle and anti-imperialism and internationalism, and in the understanding that the power of the people comes in material struggle, not just chit-chat. From the Caribbean to the Middle East, from occupied lands to blockaded islands, we are steadfast, and we steadfastly defend and love our people. And we are here to speak clearly. Empire calls itself peace, but what it enforces is domination. So to introduce ourselves, my name is Ermiya. I'm an organizer with the Action for Cuba committees and the National Network on Cuba, as well as other organizations. I'm coming to you today from the center of the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C., and I am one of your co-hosts. Passing it to you, Comrade Jessenia.
Thank you, Comrade Ermiya. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very beautiful Friday. I'm coming to you live as well from occupied Naninilape land, also known as Brooklyn, New York, where the weather is actually finally getting really nice. And unlike Comrade Ermiya, I'm also a member of the Action for Cuba committees, the New York, New Jersey chapter, and as well as the National Network on Cuba and other anti-imperialist organizations as well. And my pronouns are she, they. So thank you all for joining us and for being here for this episode. And as Ermiya said, we're going to be talking about, the unity and the anti-imperialist struggle, both in the Middle East and West Asia and the Caribe, and talking about what unites all of these, these revolutionary struggles with one another, and how we all have a common enemy that forces us to endure atrocities, and how we continue to push forward onward. And in, the words of very wise revolutionaries, the young lords, pa'lante, siempre pa'lante. That is the purpose for today's discussion, and for us, showing our solidarity with our siblings in the resistance and revolutionary struggle. So I'm going to pass it to you, Ermiya, to give us some updates on Cuba, and then we'll get started with the rest of the show as well.
Awesome, awesome. So some updates on Cuba to begin. As we know, Cuba is still under siege, not metaphorically, but materially, right? For over 6 decades, the US blockade has worked to suffocate Cuba with fuel access, medical supplies, infrastructure, and everyday life. And what we're witnessing today, which are extreme blackouts, transportation breakdowns, strain on hospitals, is not a failure, but it's a policy design of the United States. This is economic warfare. Dignity cannot be negotiated under domination. Let me repeat that. Dignity cannot be negotiated under domination. And every day we are witnessing more and more organizations and international bodies joining the calls against the inhumane blockade, which only increasingly continues to impact Cuban people's lives. The National Medical Association actually just put out a statement calling the blockade a public health crisis, and has demanded the immediate elimination of the health and humanitarian consequences of the blockade. But nonetheless, Cuba is still preparing to engage in May Day demonstrations at the end of this month, with brigadistas from all over the world visiting the island and breaking the blockade the US has tried to put on our connections with the Cuban people. And to talk about, some events that have happened this past week, as we know, the latest escalated attacks on Iran have come from Trump threatening to, quote, end Iranian civilization. This threat followed with what typically comes from deals with the US, an essentially boneless ceasefire that was shortly followed with attacks on Lebanon. Iran responded with their consistent dedication to resistance in the region, resistance for other Middle Eastern countries as well, and not just themselves, by saying attacks on Lebanon will be recognized by them as a violation of the ceasefire. And let's call it for what it is. There is this false imperialist narrative that must be dismantled, that the nations targeted by empire are somehow inherently violent. But we have to question ourselves, what do these nations actually demand? Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, Lebanon, they all demand peace. They demand sovereignty. They demand the right to determine their own futures. But under imperialism, peace is conditional. It is offered only in exchange for submission. So when that submission is refused, resistance is reframed as aggression. But let's be clear, our homelands, they're not the ones that are seeking war. But when they're attacked economically, politically, militarily, they have the right to defend themselves. And they do. And that defense is not extreme. It is a part of survival. And we have to understand that empire operates on a calculation, right? That enough pressure will produce collapse, according to their idea that if you sanction, if you isolate and assassination attempts and destabilization, that somehow it will produce organic collapse. But what we see instead is endurance. People continue. They build under blockades. They organize under surveillance. They survive under conditions designed to essentially break them. And that community, that refusal to disappear, is a direct challenge to imperial power. And to understand the conflict of today, we have to understand that what we are looking at is not isolated. We are looking at a system. The same empire targeting Iran is targeting Cuba. The same structures destabilizing Venezuela are colonizing Puerto Rico. The same forces enabling violence in Lebanon are enforcing sanctions elsewhere. Different regions, but essentially the same imperial logic. The logic of controlling resources, the logic of suppressing independence, and the logic of punishing resistance. And, to kind of go into sanctions as a tool of economic warfare, sanctions are often described as a peaceful alternative, right, by the propaganda machine, but they're not. Sanctions are an extreme act of war carried out through economic means. Virtually every country that you can think of that has stood up to US domination has been punished with economic warfare. And for this reason, the struggles of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Iran, Lebanon, Africa, Black liberation fighters here in the United States are not separate. They are interconnected expressions of resistance against the same global structure. Across the Caribbean and the Middle East, the pattern is consistent. Economic strangulation, political interference, military pressure, information warfare. There is a longstanding belief within imperial strategy that removing leaders as well will dissolve the resistance, right? We saw this with repeated attempts against Fidel Castro, to use Cuba as an example. The United States tried to assassinate Fidel over 600 times, and they completely failed. And we have to ask ourselves at some point, why is the US so persistent on assassinating a man? We also see it in the martyrdom across Iran and Lebanon, where leaders and organizers are targeted in the hope that movements will collapse, and that martyrdom of civilians, very often children, are meant to be used as deterrents. But movements are not individuals. They are people, they are memory, they are conditions, and they are necessity. And martyrdom does not end resistance. It often deepens it. So I kind of want to take us back into history, right? And to understand resistance, we have to understand history. So To take the US embassy in Iran as example, from a Western framework, it was presented as a neutral diplomatic site and one that was facing some kind of victimhood or aggression by the Iranians. But for many Iranians, particularly students at the time, it represented something else. It was a history of intervention, a center of political interference, and an extension of foreign control. So when it was seized after the revolution, it was not random. It was political. It was a rejection of domination. And what the students found in this embassy, because it was indeed students who led the charge in seizing the embassy's operations, and thus they played a pivotal role in the Iranian Revolution, confirmed what many Iranians already knew. They found thousands of records of espionage led by the embassy staff to ultimately use Iran as the US's playground. So I want to emphasize this one point, and then we'll get into discussion. Across all these struggles, one truth remains. People do not accept domination quietly. And despite sanctions, despite violence, despite isolation, they continue. They build, they resist, and they refuse to disappear under the boot of empire. I'm going to repeat that one more time. They refuse to disappear under the boot of empire. So, Comrade Jessenia, now pulling you in for some discussion, I wanted to ask you, resistance, as I mentioned, is so often framed as aggression in dominant narratives. How much do we think people in the US have fallen for this narrative? And how do we as organizers combat it, since we do have a deep responsibility to the people here and the people abroad?
Thank you so much for that question. And I do apologize if there's some background noise. Someone is cleaning up the community garden in the back outside. So if that's heard, apologies for that. But I think that this is a very powerful question, especially the fact that this is something that we have to consistently combat against. As we know, the imperialists use hegemonic and communication warfare against our movements to manipulate the masses and to force them to, live under a paradigm of illusion and a reality that isn't really in the way that it is, as we know, right? Because we are students of, the revolution, and we are trying to take on the mantle of being guides and teachers. We are able to, resist the propaganda and the U.S. corporate media that we're constantly forced to watch, endure wherever we go when we're in the empire. And I think that this is something that, the framing of viewing resistance as aggression is the dominant narrative here in the empire and in other reactionary nations and countries as well, because of the reach and the I guess the economic control that these media systems have, right? So I think the people in the United States, those who are still under this paradigm of illusion, have fallen victim to this narrative because they view, the enemy as not being the imperialists. They view the enemy as being, the glorified and the righteous people who are resisting against oppression. And Malcolm X said, never let your enemy tell you who your enemy is, right? Or I'm paraphrasing in that sort of sense. But it's very dangerous when we live in a reality where we're told who we should be hating, right? Who we should be viewing as the enemy rather than coming to this conclusion ourselves, which is something that I think as organizers, the deep responsibility that we have in order to combat this is by engaging in popular education with the masses and having them understand that the information that they are receiving is not truthful. It is fitting a narrative to manufacture consent for genocide, for destruction, for continual oppression, and it's forcing people to live under a system and under a reality of ignorance and arrogance, right? So I think by engaging with everyday people, having these difficult conversations, being political, right, but also holding on to accessible language in a way that doesn't like, intimidate them or bring down their morale in which they seem or think that like the reality of everything is just like we're all doomed and there's no way for us to be able to resist or push forward. It's important for us to still engage in that way while not destroying that character that they can have and they can build to continue to resist and then join our resistance movement as well. So a bit of a ramble, but I think that it is something that is very important to highlight in the sense that we have to engage in popular education, meeting the people where they are, and then also uplifting them while not bringing down their morale because we all need each other and we need as many people as we are able to get and to build up in order to be successful. And as we've seen in historically, right, small groups have been able to resist a gigantic and a large enemy. But the more support that we have with one another, the more substantial and the more endurance that we have in order to, inshallah, achieve our means and to finally bring victory against oppression and violence once and for all.
Yes, indeed. And, kind of talking more about this political strength that you mentioned, I wanted to ask you, how does martyrdom transform into political strength, especially in countries like Iran and Lebanon, where religion plays a huge part in their political discipline because the leading anti-imperialist force is the Islamic resistance. So tell us a little bit more about the concept of martyrdom in the global South and in the Middle East in particular.
Yeah, so I think the concept of martyrdom is actually a very beautiful understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought to, humanity through the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, in the sense of that this is the highest form of showing a love for humanity, of fulfilling a responsibility to resist and fight against oppression, even if it comes at the cost of your own life, right? And a lot of, racist or regressive individuals like to critique jihad as making it seem as if it's this horrible thing, right? But jihad literally means to struggle, right? It is to struggle against oppression. So, fulfilling the duty and the promise of that each and every one of us took upon coming to this plane of existence, because it is a trust that was given to us by Allah. Um, Allah told us that it would be very difficult for you to live right in humanity, to live on this world, because of the concept of, you having the ability to choose to either do good or to either do evil, right? Um, and martyrdom essentially transforms that loss of like the essence of, you not being prisoner to evil and being someone who upholds good. It brings that sort of understanding, and it transforms the concept of losing someone who fought against oppression and not viewing it as a loss, right? And the way that we see it in the Ummah, is that if anyone dies in the cause of Allah, it's not as if they've died, right? They're still alive because that essence of their spirit, that essence of them being able to, fight for something and sacrifice for something much larger than themselves is the most beautiful thing that a person can do, right? And it transforms, I guess, this kind of materialistic view of having a fear of death and solely having an acceptance of it. Because the only thing that is very certain for us in this world is that one day we will we're going to die, right? And that should come with dignity. It should come with us fulfilling a responsibility that we choose for ourselves. It cannot be something that is imposed on us in the way that we see, the imperialist enemy forcing people to live under exploitation, forcing them to either endure choosing between debt or dying for an unworthy and unjust cause, right? Martyrdom transforms that into you solely viewing that the value of your life is one that is given, right? It's highest importance, but it is one that it is not only for yourself, but it is for the betterment of your sibling. So I think that that's the concept that even in my own studies and furthering my understanding of Islam, and seeing the resistance movements in Iran and Lebanon, and how the people of also of Palestine and Sudan and Congo have been able to, see such horrors and still be able to hold on to the sanctity of their heart, because they know that if death is something that is brought about because they fought to fight against oppression, then that is the best thing that they could have done, right? And for us, persecution is something that is worse than killing an evildoer, or it is something that is worse than having to live and endure under oppression. So not fighting against oppression is seen as cowardly, and becoming a martyr is a gift, right? Because it meant that you fought against oppression until your last dying breath. And I think that that is what has brought a lot of like political discipline in Iran, and in Lebanon, in West Asia. And as we see, the growing resistance in the Caribe, and this understanding is a bit different. It's still rooted in the same understanding that us fighting for a world that is actually one that is filled with justice and peace, and we are able to live in harmony, is much better than to live under one where oppression is just freely um, like done, and it's not challenged, essentially. So I think that that's how martyrdom and plays a huge role in establishing that political line, but why it's enabled and strengthened the people of West Asia, as we currently see, as much as it has.
Yes, indeed. And I think, on the topic of sacrifice, right? I think sacrifice is an incredibly important tradition in resistance. I think, it's not just the people in the Middle East and abroad, but also our heroes here in America that talked about sacrifice. Huey P. Newton wrote extensively about sacrifice. And I think we have to recognize just how important it is that as people who live in the imperial core, that we have to make ourselves uncomfortable. We have to put something that is important on the line. So, speaking a little bit more about this, how can solidarity move beyond symbolism into material action? What are the demands that are coming from the Caribbean and the Middle East?
Well, yeah, I think that this is also an important question to get to the root of. And I think that as we see currently, much of our solidarity with the resistance movements that are happening globally have been more symbolic than actually bringing about, actual changes to the material conditions in the world. And it's not to say that, us uplifting ourselves on one unified voice and hitting the streets and actually, causing disturbances and forcing an imperialist corporations to actually shut down operations, because much of like those movements that have been happening within the imperial core have been successful in shutting down weapons manufacturing companies here in the United States, but also in other global North imperialist nations. I think that the demand that comes from our siblings in the Caribe and also in West Asia, and our comrades in the Caribe and in the Middle East and West Asia, is that when time calls for it, will we actually put down like our comforts, the crumbs of luxury that we are able to afford here in the imperial core, and will we actually sacrifice all of that to actually go and fight against the imperialists if they are actually, fulfill their or go through with the threats that they have issued against, the people of this world. How many of us will actually pick up, arms and fight if asked to, right? And I think that this is something that, obviously it's not something that should be asked of everyone. It should be asked of those who, are willing to actually lay down their lives and actually sacrifice themselves in order to bring about, progression, to resist against oppression, and to resist against our enemy once and for all, to bring about victory. I think that this is one of the ways that we can move from symbolism into material action. But another way is for us to continue engaging in popular education with one another, right? Because before there can be action, there has to be understanding. You have to understand what it is that you are fighting against and why it is that you are fighting against. And this is something that I know, we know, right? That the masses have this understanding, they have this clarity, because they do, within the imperial core, they are very conscientious of the injustices that they are forced to endure, but they probably aren't as aware of how the injustices that we are forced to endure here in the imperial core is only a mirror of what our siblings are forced to endure globally, right? And as the first question, it highlighted how, how the US frames like resistance as aggression in that dominant narrative. Much of them think that their enemy is Iran. Much of them think that their enemy is Lebanon. Much of them think that their enemy is Cuba. And this is wrong, right? Because these are nations, and these are people who continue to resist oppression and continue to fight against it, right? So I think it's those two things. Educating ourselves, one another, continuing being students as we step into the role of being teachers, to guide the masses, but then also those who are willing, right, to actually um, sacrifice the comfort of being able to continue on living the life as we live it here in the empire, and fighting for a just cause. Because again, persecution is the worst thing to endure. It's worse than killing. It's worse. Oppression is worse than killing. And you said it earlier in the segment, that these countries, the resistance movements, they are fighting to defend, right? But in the Quran, it says that you should attack as they have attacked you, and if they call for peace, then you grant it, because Allah loves moderation, not excess, right? So I think that this is a principle that we need to hold very deep within ourselves. And I know that this is an understanding that Huey Newton even had, because he flirted with the idea of Islam, but then came to the conclusion himself that he wanted to be a revolutionary socialist, and that was something that he fulfilled up until the last moment, right? He fought for the liberation of the people against oppression. So I think that this is discipline that we need to continue to, build within ourselves, build within the people, but also bring about that understanding much more deeper, to move away from symbolism into material action.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And talking more about this material action, I want to go into a little bit about Cuba's solidarity with Iran and the broader Middle Eastern resistance. Um, let's talk a little bit about President Diaz-Canel and how vocal he's been in support of Iran at this moment, and also just the party more generally. We cannot ignore just how much Cuba has been completely steadfast and completely unwavering and their solidarity with Middle Eastern resistance.
Yeah. I think that what we see, right, with Cuba expressing like full-on support for the resistance in the Middle East, with giving support to the Islamic Republic of Iran and also the Islamic Revolutionary Guard of Iran, but also being very vocal and being supportive of the resistance movement in Palestine, right, as they resist against Zionist aggression and genocide. It's the understanding that our struggles are interconnected with one another, and our enemy is a common enemy, right? The same enemy that is imposing a complete oil and economic blockade on Cuba through unilateral cohesive measures is the same one that has forced these unilateral cohesive measures, also known as sanctions, on Iran, right? They've employed the same tactics as trying to, cripple the economic structure of Cuba and Iran to try to bring about regime change from within, thinking that if they made the lives difficult of the people and limiting their access to certain, materials, limiting their access to economic mobility, that this will bring about, oh, sorry, my cat, that this will bring about, dissatisfaction to the point of them rebelling against both revolutions, right? The ongoing Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Revolutionary Government, but also resisting against the Islamic Republic. And this is further from the truth. And if anything, it actually strengthens the resolve and the trust that the people have for their governments, for their revolutionary leaders, because they have the understanding that, as we see in Cuba and as we see in Iran, that they're not going to let the U.S. imperialists or the Zionist imperialists get their way, right? They're not going to allow them to control the dynamic and the framework of their society and decide how they wish to, because they are aware of their history and they know what the reality of these countries were when the United States was in control over the dynamics, right? As we saw with, the overthrow of Florencio Bautista, who was a U.S. dictator, political puppet. And then also with the overthrow of the democratic leader of Iran, Mohammed Mossadegh, in 1959, right? And with the implementation of the Shah, who was overthrown by Ayatollah Khamenei, with the Islamic revolution that came about, they are aware of what the material conditions were. They were aware and they remember the oppression, the inequality that ran through their society. And it's something that they don't want to regress back into, and enable the reactionary forces to be able to continue onward with controlling the ability for these countries to decide their movements, to decide the progression of their nations as they choose to. So I think it's important for us to continue to highlight the fact that the reality of these countries before these revolutions came about, what it was, and to remind people of the true history and the true reality of having to live under imperial exploitation and oppression. So I think that that is the unifying force between Cuba and Iran, and this is something that President Miguel Diaz-Canel holds a very firm understanding, and in being able to challenge, the tactics of the enemy to divide and conquer by making our movements seem as if they're silos or that they move isolated from one another is another challenge that we have to continue to resist against. But challenging that comes from holding on to the firmness of what the historic reality was while these nations were under imperial control, and what are the current material conditions, right? That these countries, such as Iran and Cuba, are able to to endure under and still bring about revolutionary change and progression, despite the regressive tactics of the empire, imposing sanctions on their economic framework, and attempts to isolate these nations, which, as we talked in previous segments, has been very futile because, as we see currently, and as we have seen, the international community has always come to the support of Cuba and Iran.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
And
indeed.
Kat is a guest on the show now.
And welcome, Comrade Kat. Well, Comrade Jessenia, I turn it back to you. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the resistance in the Caribbean, both historically and what's happening now. So tell us a little bit more about that. And yeah, I just turn the time over to you now.
Yes, thank you so much. And as I was saying a bit, the reality of holding on to what like the current material conditions are in Cuba, and how they our Cuban comrades have been able to, resist against the complete oil blockade that the dictatorship of this imperial country has imposed since December of last year, of which they just received support from Russia with bringing over 700,000 tons of crude oil, to be able to, help out with the electric blackouts, and then the energy devastation that's happening, but also with the installation of solar panels, with the help of China and other nations as well, and also the delivery of material aid, and material solidarity efforts from Mexico, as we saw from organizers who went on the Nuestra America convoy, and all of the support that they've been able to receive from friends and comrades of Cuba. We see, this resistance to continue onward, because of the unity of the youth with the Cuban revolutionary government, right? And as we know, the youth students are one of the most potent vanguards that we have in our resistance movement, because they are not only just the present, but they bring about the movement of the future as we would like to see it happen, right? So just last week, we saw tens of thousands of young people, of youth, students of Cuba, continue to resist against U.S. imperialist aggression, by doing a bike rally. So this was a challenge, and a show that you can cut off essentially our access to gas, our access to be able to sustain our electric grid. But that won't stop our ability to move with one another, or to show support for our government, because the youth is very conscientious who the enemy is and who is causing the devastation that they are forced to endure under. All right. So they did a bike rally. They came out in regular manual bicycles and scooters, to show support for the Cuban government. And this is something that they did to highlight the fact that the revolutionary character won't be quelled. And also to also talk about the reality that they are presently forced to endure. So, like as we saw during COVID, globally, with students having to attend virtual classes, which, as we see, the after effects of this is causing a form of isolation, or unfortunately has led to a mental health crisis. This is something that we see is probably one of the motives behind why the United States has decided to move forward with imposing the total oil blockade, right? That they want to bring down the morale of the youth and the students, to continue their evil means of trying to control and exploit Cuba, and regressing it back to before the 1959 revolution. But the students continue to endure. They've found like innovative ways to still connect with one another, and still hold on to relations with each other by going out publicly, by walking, by going on bike rides with each other. If they attend classes virtually, then it's a different dynamic, but it still is a way for them to still be in community with one another and still have collective learning with each other. Similarly to, I guess, to the resistance that we see in Cuba, we see the same resistance in Puerto Rico presently too. And a revolutionary poet of ours, who also spent some time exiled in Cuba, Lola Rodriguez del Tio, wrote a very beautiful poem in which she said that Cuba and Puerto Rico are two wings of a bird, who receive their flowers or bullets in the same heart. And we see that very clearly with resistance against privatization efforts in Puerto Rico with the public universities. So presently, there are students in Puerto Rico who attend the University of Puerto Rico, which is also known as ELUPI, la DUPI, and they're resisting against, fascist repression that's being facilitated and enforced by the imperialist political puppet party of the PNP, which in English is the New Progressive Party, and it is nothing progressive. It is actually very regressive, and they are sympathetic to the U.S. fascists. And this is the means of privatizing the universities in Puerto Rico is to keep Puerto Rico vulnerable to exploitation and oppression. And they continue to influence the university system to force sympathy for fascist values and ideas, to try to bring about support, manufacture more support for the people, to convert Puerto Rico from being an occupied nation, a neo-colony, into a state. And this is the party, the PNP is the party of the statehood. And as we saw with what happened in Hawaii, as we saw with what happened in Alaska, this brought about the complete, degradation of the cultural and economic framework of the people, where they were forced to live under oppression, and they are essentially, strangers in their own homeland. And their homeland was converted into this haven for tourists to continue to exploit, and to just go there to vacation while not having an understanding that people actually live there, right? And this is the reality as we see in Puerto Rico. And the material conditions in Puerto Rico differ from Cuba in the sense of how the tourism sector affects both Puerto Rico and Cuba. Well, tourism is something that is beneficial to the Cuban, economy, and it prevents isolation. As we see in Puerto Rico, it furthers exploitation and oppression. And essentially, what the United States imperialist government and the PNP is doing is they're removing protections for students, specifically students of the LGBT plus and queer community, by eliminating gender inclusive bathrooms, mimicking far right, policies, and also the university administration is purposefully allowing for the infrastructure to deteriorate due to negligence, and a lack of respect for the space of these students and the safety of themselves, right? And this is all done. It can sound like a conspiracy theory, but it is actually something that we are plainly aware of. It's just done to force the youth to have no choice but to engage in usury, right? And intergenerational debt by taking out high interest loans, and being vulnerable to ROTC enrollment, which is just becoming essentially cannon fodder for imperialist aggression and wars and genocides. So the imperialists continue to use Puerto Rico as their own military playground, and they do it in the sense of misguiding and misleading the youth so that they have no choice but to fight against their siblings in the Caribe. And And as we've heard, unfortunately, from the crazy dictator of this country, that after Venezuela, it was going to be Iran and then Cuba. Puerto Ricans don't want to fight against Venezuela. Puerto Ricans do not want to fight against Cuba. We don't want to fight against our siblings in Haiti or anywhere, right? All we want to do is live in harmony with one another and to bring about a world that is filled with peace and justice and peace, because to get to peace, we need to have justice. So I think it's important for us to, while we discuss, the repression that the United States is forcing onto Cuba, we don't forget that Cuba and Puerto Rico are viewed as one single nation with one another, right? We are sibling nations, and what happens to Cuba affects us directly, but what happens in Puerto Rico also affects our Cuban siblings. So the realities of why there is, infrastructure deterioration in Cuba is as a result of the U.S. blockade and the limiting of access to materials, or even, like construction materials that can be used to build up this infrastructure, and then also lack of access to programming and schooling materials because of the difficulty of the blockade to get access to this, or even have like economic means to pay for it. The reality in Puerto Rico is this is because of purposeful negligence from the government. So in Cuba, it's because of an external pressure um, that's preventing the government from being able to provide the support for their youth and their students to the best of their ability and as much as they would like to. But in Puerto Rico, it comes also from an external and internal imperialist force that goes against the means of the people, because they do not move together as one. So I'm going to repeat that one more time so that people do not get confused. In Cuba, the Cuban government and the people, the youth and the students, move together as one. And in Puerto Rico, the government and the resistance movement and the youth do not move together as one. So this is why we are seeing this separation and this degradation that is happening in Puerto Rico, which is completely different as to the reasons why it is unfortunately happening in Cuba because of imperialist, the United States imperialist aggression and unilateral cohesive measures that they are forcing them to endure. Um, so that's just a bit of information on the context between, the unity between the youth with the Cuban revolutionary government, but also how the student resistance in Puerto Rico is resisting against the reactionary Puerto Rican government in inspiration from, the resistance movements that we see happening in Iran against the Zionists, but also the unity of the youth with preserving and continuing onward with the Cuban Revolution. So a lot of the inspiration is coming from, the youth of the world being able to, um, sacrifice to build up political strength, to bring about, resistance against oppression from the enemy, while understanding that in Puerto Rico, we have the duty to build up our nation as we see fit, but not in isolation from the ongoing, revolutionary movements that are happening in Cuba and Iran, but taking inspiration from them to bring about a reality in which Puerto Rico is able to be like Cuba, and or able to be like Iran, depending on how we decide to move forward. But that decision should come from ourselves, and it should come in being in full unity and partnership with other revolutionary resistance movements as well. Um, and we also wanted to discuss a bit, right, on how, these in Cuba and Iran, both, right, have been able to successfully pay homage and honor revolutionary leaders and heroes, right? And as we see with the upliftment of, Brother Malcolm X, in Iran, in which they've put his face on a stamp, on a government stamp, but they've also put him on a on a missile that was being sent to the occupied nation of Palestine, right? And to the illegal entity of Israel, of showing that there is unity with resisting against a nation, in this sense, the United States, that assassinates our revolutionary leaders and then later onwards sanitizes their image. It's also a way of showing that, Iran is not the enemy of the Black or African people. They are not the enemy of the resistance movement that is growing here within the belly of the beast. If anything, they are firmly aware that Malcolm X was a martyr. It was a revolutionary that we should honor with like the highest veneration, and it is an example that we need to follow, right? That discipline, those principalities of being able to resist against, this programming to just continue onward, the cycle of fascism, of being solely like a zombie and not questioning anything. It was something that he was able to break out of, and unfortunately, it came when he was forced to endure the for-profit carceral system. But there, he was able to meet individuals, to meet a brotherhood that brought him to guidance. It wasn't something that brought him to isolation or repression. It brought him to revelation, to truth. And he took on that mantle of not only, becoming a spokesperson and becoming a voice for the movement. He essentially became a very honorable teacher, and he fulfilled the duty of, of sacrificing the comfort of living under a system that rewards those who do not question, but penalizes those who question, right? He took on that mantle of questioning and providing answers up until his last dying breath. So this is something that we see our comrades in Cuba and Iran taking on that mantle as well, of continuing to question and continuing to speak truth against unjust power, to educate the world, to free it of this veil of illusion, to free it of this veil of oppression, because we need to build a global society in which whatever is in Cuba is something that is replicated all across the land, right? Whatever is built within Iran is replicated all across the land, because everyone deserves access to education. Everyone deserves access to healthcare. This is something that shouldn't be something that is only tied to your employment. This is not something that should only be tied to how productive you are to the society in which you live in. This is a responsibility of the government to ensure that every single individual that lives within their nation, that lives within their country, has access to these things. And as we see in Cuba and Iran, this is integral to their framework, and this is what our enemy continues to attack. This is what the imperialists continue to try to make us think is like this out of the world idea, and that it shouldn't be in that way, because they want to continue with their ignorance and their arrogance and their exploitation of the people of this world. So that's a bit of what we wanted to discuss, and not to ramble too much or preach too much to the choir, since I'm sure most of our listeners have this understanding, and to those who are learning with us, this is something that should continue to be discussed in further conversations. And I kind of want to get into a bit of a discussion, and ask you, Ermiya, right? We've been talking a bit about how Western imperialists critique falsely, like claiming Cuba represses dissent, or that Iran like executes like political prisoners. Why do those same critiques remain silent on the US and Israeli bombings and genocides of residential areas and hospitals in Lebanon and Yemen, the arming of genocide in Palestine and Sudan, and the destruction of Puerto Rican infrastructure? Is this not like an accusation of authoritarianism, sorry, against Iran and Cuba, itself a weapon of imperialist distraction and propaganda?
Well, Comrade, I think that you mentioned something very important, which is every single country has an authority that is ruling it, right? Here in the so-called United States, we live under the dictatorship of capitalism. We live under the authority of people who are constantly oppressing working class and oppressed people through the rising of rents, through the execution of people who are resisting ICE in our streets, through the repression of student activists who dare to speak up against Palestine. In fact, scholars who were in Iran and moved to the United States, who study Palestine, have even mentioned themselves they were more freely able to express their scholarship in the University of Iran than they are here in the United States. In the United States, they were fired for their scholarship. And so I think we have to understand that in a world where there is always a political alliance, there is always an authority that is in power, we cannot live in an idealistic, egotistical, highly ultra left notion that there is ever going to be no authority, right? Because that's just not the case. And so when we recognize that the authority that is in power in Cuba, the authority that is in power in Iran, is a politically disciplined authority where the people, like you said, are moving one with the government and the government moves one with the people, right? And so as the imperialists build this consent to make us believe it is okay for them to bomb Iran and to sanction Cuba and to create these inhumane ways of punishing people all over the global south, we have to recognize that this accusation of authoritarianism is a huge way as to how they build that consent, right? It's a huge way as to how they make us believe these countries are our enemies, when in all actuality, these countries have significantly more in common with working people here in the US than our government could ever. And so I think we have to be aware of that. And we have to be aware that there is a new Red Scare that's on the rise. There is a new repression that's on the rise of people who dare speak up against war, who dare speak up against the brutalization of ICE, who dare speak up against the repression of women and queer and trans people. And executions by ICE forces are happening here in the streets of the United States, right? They're not happening in Iran. We witnessed people such as Alex Preddy getting executed live through video, through this isn't just word of mouth, but through an actual video proof right here in the United States. And so I think we have to be aware of that, and we have to recognize just how much the critique lies within our own country, within our own government. Regime change and authoritarianism is not the accusation we need to be pointing to Iran or Cuba. It's an accusation we need to be pointing to here in Washington, D.C. The regime change needs to happen here in D.C.
Oh yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that last part because that's what I was thinking. I was like, it sounds like regime change needs to happen here within the belly of the beast, and that our sibling nations of Cuba and Iran need to be left alone, right, to for the people and the government to decide how they want to progress further, because the working class here in the belly of the beast has more in common with the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, has more in common with the revolutionary people of Iran, has more in common with our comrades in Cuba, right? In which we are all resisting against US imperialist aggression. We're all resisting against a constant small ruling class of people who want to decide our collective future against our own will, right? And as we continue to see, that is through the means of exploitation and oppression, and which is our duty to resist against. And to the martyrs who were unfortunately killed by Gestapo ICE agents, they took on that mantle of removing that veil through the sacrifice of their own lives, of seeing like this is the violence that the empire is forcing us to endure here in the imperial core is one that they export across the entire world, and it is something that we cannot allow for the continuation of, right? And they do this by forcing people to live under poverty, under starvation, right? And it's all to force consent to move in the way that they wish for us to move, right? And I guess my other question that I wanted to ask you is, talking a bit about like what is happening in the sister nation of Cuba's, Puerto Rico, right? If a Puerto Rican student is forced to choose between ROTC because their family is starving due to US colonial poverty, is that choice not manufactured by the empire? And does Cuba or Iran's like system ever force youth into a choice between, death or debt? Like, have we ever seen that before the revolution as being the reality that they forced their youth to endure or accept?
I think you mentioned a very, very important point, which is, debt is almost a guarantee here in the United States for our youth, right? I think there was a poll that said the overwhelming majority of youth recognize that they'll get into some debt going into their adult lives here in the US. And a majority are afraid to even be able to live on their own because they don't know if they can pay rent.
Mhm.
And so when we understand that debt is such a system of control against our future generations here in the US, we also have to look at these alternative countries such as Cuba and Iran and see how their system is set up. Because in Cuba, education is 100% free, from preschool to law school to medical school. If you are wanting to study any kind of discipline at any level, from PhD to master's to undergraduate to associates, you are not charged for it in Cuba. And so, a
Mhm.
country that is, like we mentioned in the prior discussion, constantly accused of authoritarianism, well, they're the only country here in the Western Hemisphere that doesn't treat education as a commodity, that doesn't treat education as a business. And so, when we are looking at the landscape of, well, what countries are better for our future generations? What countries are young people actually thriving in? The ability to start their own families, the ability to buy homes, the ability to go to school. We have to look at places such as Cuba and such as Iran and compare every aspect of life to the United States, because we know for a fact that their youth are flourishing when our youth are in many ways afraid for their futures. You mentioned the attacks on, queer and trans youth just a couple of comments ago in Puerto Rico, due to the colonial policy of the United States, of course, that is being enforced upon them. In Iran, this is not the case. In Iran, trans young women are fully integrated into their society as women and are fully allowed to participate in all of women's sports and activities and spaces. And this kind of anti-trans, backwards, reactionary hysteria does not exist towards trans youth in Iran. And so, for young people who indeed are a marginalized group of people, children are incredibly marginalized and oppressed in the society. It is especially important for youth to understand these connections and to understand what it means when the United States fails to provide them a future, but other countries, even the countries that they claim are our enemies, are providing them hope and are providing them a better alternative. Um, so I think youth have a great deal to learn from other countries, especially Cuba and especially Iran, and especially these places that are the heart of resistance.
I think you said it beautifully, that youth, they have, they should learn from these other countries, such as Cuba and Iran. And these places are the heart of the resistance. And it is a duty that we have as organizers, within the imperial core, within the heart of the belly of the beast, to continue providing this education, to continue providing this guidance, but to also learn ourselves from these resistance movements, because our duty is to bring about the progression for the youth. Kwame Ture said, like, we're probably not going to see like this like revolutionary change or this revolutionary progression ourselves, right? But this is something that we do for the betterment of future society, of future of future groups of youth, of people that are going to come about, right? And as we know, like, the youth are the future, so our responsibility is to build a future in which they can live and not be repressed, and ease, right, the suffering as much as possible. And another thing that I thought was very beautiful that you mentioned is this very firm understanding in Iran, which I think has to be translated and brought into the consciousness of everyone, that our trans siblings are men and women. The fact that we here in the belly of the beast, like the usage of trans, I understand like the history, but we firmly view our trans siblings as they choose to be, right? There's no way of us deciding or forcing people to have to endure with living under like a gender identity or a sexual identity, a sex identity that goes against how they themselves feel, right? Or how they themselves think of themselves, or view themselves, or even choose to present themselves moving forward, right? It's something that Iran, the Revolutionary Guard, and also the Islamic Republic knows that to force somebody to live under the identity that you wish for them is a form of oppression, is a form of exploitation. And if we don't want to live in oppression, how can I oppress my sibling who wants to choose to live their life in the way that they choose to, and to be in the body that they know themselves to have to be under? That's regressive, right? That's a form of oppression. So I think it was very beautiful for you to just firmly say that the understanding of the trans community is something that is fully supported, because they are viewed as living as they choose to, and there's no question about it, which is a teaching and an understanding that needs to come about and flourish here, in the belly of the beast, in the imperial core, because unfortunately, our trans siblings, or the queer community, is facing a systemic institutionalized repression that, as we know, and hopefully in future segments we can talk further about this, is leading to a lot of devastation, right? And it is a movement that is constantly being attacked by the far right, and conservative, like, religious groups who cannot get with behind the understanding that that's not a choice that is up to you, right? And hopefully this is my way of plugging for us to talk about this in the future. But I think it's a very beautiful way for us to, end the segment, and bring about the firm understanding that the youth is the future, and allowing our siblings to live as they choose to is something that we cannot oppress or repress from them. This is a choice that is something that should be supported. And as we see in Iran, it's that support has become, like, systemic support, and facilitating, gender reassignment surgery, and providing access to, like, hormonal medications and stuff like that. But this is an ongoing struggle in Puerto Rico, in the United States. And as we see with, like, the progression of, the movement towards implementing and changing the family code to bring about, this further, acceptance and repression, not repression, sorry, acceptance, sorry, into the society, to leave room for our trans siblings and the LGBT plus community, to be able to live as they choose to, right? As we choose to. So not to take on too much more time, but we kind of wanted to just end the segment with, providing some network updates, and also providing a call to action. So as we know, we're currently into, I think, month 3 of the illegal kidnapping and the imperialist aggression that happened in Venezuela. And as I said, the illegal kidnapping against democratically elected President Nicolas Maduro and first combatant Celia Flores. They are still being kept in a concentration camp here in Brooklyn, New York. And it is our duty to continue to resist against this imprisonment, this kidnapping, and we have to demand as a network of people, as revolutionaries, to continue going to the streets, calling for the release, to continue educating as to what exactly happened in Venezuela on January 1st, January 3rd, and continue to, resist against the illegal detainment and the facilitation and allowing of concentration camps to even operate within the imperial core, as we see with the illegal detentions and kidnappings of our siblings in ICE concentration camps, our siblings who are still forced to endure horrible carceral systems and practices in the for-profit industrial complex and carceral system here. This is something that we need to continue providing support because literally the empire uses imprisonment as a way to quell resistance, but also to try to break the human spirit into submission. And to prevent that from actually happening, our siblings who find themselves in the concentration camp need to know that we are in full solidarity with them, but also need to have that awareness that we will do whatever it is that we can in order to break those chains of of repression and oppression, to eventually get all of these prison gates open once and for all. And that is something that we have to, continue to resist and call attention to. And, in providing, solidarity with our siblings who are forced to live under repressive and, regressive forms of systems. We see this very plainly in the imperial core, and those who are fortunate enough to be on the outside, not in a different form of prison, because as Malcolm X said, like, we're still in prison, right? We're still in the imprisonment of imperial control, and most of us are still imprisoned by the mental slavery of buying into propaganda and not being able to remove the veil of illusions. It is our duty to educate each other, to get that to finally and once and for all not be the reality. And another form of duty, it's not to give into symbolic forms of, providing material solidarity, but the caravans for Cuba, which is not a symbolic form of material solidarity, it's more so of a taking on the responsibility that we have as having access to medical supplies, to other forms of material aid. That is it's a difficult in terms of like limited access to monetary funds at times, but it is not difficult in getting access to it due to the networks of support that we have. Like over-the-counter medicines for us, we can go to any corporate pharmacy and be able to to get access to this and unfortunately it comes from like these big monopolies, right, as such as Walgreens or CVS or anything like that. This is not the reality for our Cuban comrades, right? Getting access to Tylenol, to Advil, to other forms of much more complex like medication, it's very difficult due to the blockade and the unilateral cohesive measures and the restraints that are imposed on them in that sort of way. We take on the responsibility of being able to gather up all of this material and bring it down to Cuba in whatever way we can. So the Caravans for Cuba is a project and a coalition that was put together by many of the locales that are a part of that are ACCs, that are locales that are working groups or collectives in unity with the National Network on Cuba. And many of our comrades have driven from very long distances to meet up in South Carolina. Some have come from Michigan, other from Tennessee. The New York caravan just recently left and met up with Philly, and then I think they were able to make it to South Carolina with no hiccups, mashallah. They're all going to be heading down to Florida to load the aid onto, a charter plane that's heading to Cuba at the end of this month with the Mayday Brigade, of which Comrade Ermiya and myself will be attending, mashallah. And we'll be bringing all of this much needed material aid to our comrades there, which will be distributed to, clinics, schools, hospitals, and other institutions as well, in direct connection and partnership with the Cuban government and with the Cuban people. So again, everything moves together as one. It is not isolated, and we'll be talking a bit more about this, I think towards the end of this month. And we should probably open it up to any questions that, people have in regards to how the aid would be distributed or anything like that, to dispel any, propaganda that is pushed forward by the empire, right, to bring about this lack of understanding. And then also another plug and another national network on Cuba update. So we're going to be having two bylaws meetings upcoming. The next one should be on April 16th. We'll be discussing the draft of the bylaws. So hopefully in that conversation, we'll be able to, if there's any disagreements, and it's a small group of disagreements, or dissenters, whatever like misunderstandings that they have, those will be answered, and to the majority of the comrades who are in favor of the bylaws, it's just a conversation for us to be able to talk things out, see what works, what doesn't work, what language we should keep, what language we shouldn't keep, and then hopefully on May 30th, during the NNOC spring meeting, we'll be finalizing the bylaws and voting on implementing them, and then having them a part of the National Network on Cuba's, policy on how we move forward as one, right? And then there's also the Centennial of Fidel Brigade, and this is a collaborative brigade that's happening between the Venceremos Brigade and also the National Network on Cuba, and applications close on April 15th. And they actually have their last open house scheduled for today at 6:30 Eastern time. So I will be sharing the link for both to register for the open house and then also to apply for the brigade itself. So in 1 minute, I'll be sharing it. I just shared in the chat on the YouTube the link to apply to register for the open house, and then also shared the link to apply for the applications, which close on April 15th. So please get those applications in. Please attend the open house, and any questions that you have, our comrades from the VB will be more than happy and very willing to answer any of them, and to talk to you a bit more about, why commemorating the centennial of Fidel is important, but also why going to Cuba now more than ever is important, to be in full material solidarity, and to show, full support for the revolution, and to actually, Noemi, who is I think one of the directors of ECAP, said that now is when we see who truly is a friend of Cuba. So by going to Cuba, and being in full solidarity is another way of showing friendship, but also revolutionary discipline, especially against ongoing imperialist aggression and intimidation tactics that our enemy will not be successful in fulfilling or coming through. As we see with the absolute defeat and the absolute discipline that the United States is forced to come to terms with from the resistance in Iran. So yeah, those are just some of the things that we wanted to plug. And I hope that you all enjoyed today's segment and today's conversation. And stay tuned for the next show, which inshallah will happen on next week, Friday. And we'll be talking about the family code and women in the Cuban Revolution. So thank you all so much. And may Allah bless you all with ease and patience. Thank you.
All
Bye.
parts of people.
All power to the people.